Friday, the 26th of April, 2019. My, how time flies. Jane Curtis is here this morning, and she's going to bring us up to date, or at least give us some history, on the little country of Iraq. And we hear so much about it, but what do we know about it? What are you going to tell us about it?
Well, there's quite a bit to tell, and a lot of information out there. But we're going to treat it, or I'm going to treat it, like a sort of epic, where we highlight some of the key episodes in the long history, and then fill in between with a little narrative.
Okay.
But of course, Mesopotamia is the original name of that area where the two rivers come down, the Tigris and the Euphrates, down in the Persian Gulf. And that started, sometimes called the cradle of humanity.
That's right, it is.
Now, apparently original humanoid people started in Africa somewhere, but Mesopotamia gets the prize for being the start of real human
civilization.
Human creatures, human creatures such as we know them today. And then the first civilizations really began. You go way back, 60,000 years and more back, and people were sort of coming out of the wilderness, as it were.
Right.
But the New Stone Age, the Neolithic Age, was when people began to farm, and archaeology has shown that they were amongst the first, if not the first, in that area to farm.
Oh.
And curiously, the soil is very fertile, but it's so dry that it has to be irrigated or it doesn't produce anything. And curiously, 8,000 years ago, the climate was much like it is now at that point in the geographical conditions, which is a sort of interesting.
Right.
You'd think that would lend a certain amount of stability, but it has not done that. But as other areas nearby began to be populated with people, civilizations began. When you had Egypt, Syria, Turkey, all around there, they had more neighbors, and they had extensive trade relations in the early days. And they had local tribes was the unit of government, of civilization there. But they very early discovered mathematics, astronomy, of course, agriculture. They got to trading with their neighbors and really became a part of the world community. And they were then, as now, by a couple of millennia BC, surrounded by other countries, which were also rather burgeoning and almost bumptious at times, aggressive and so on. But in the second millennium or so BC, the Persians began to rise. Their civilization rose, and of course that's just east. Now let's look at a map for a moment here. Let's look at a couple of maps, in fact. The first picture of all is going to show us a hopeful thing here. This was a coat of arms which existed for Iraq in the few years in which it was independent in modern sense of the term and not ruled by a dictator. And it was reflects some of the things in the past. The lion reflects Persian domination. The horse, I presume, a later period where the Hittites, the people, and then the Mongols with their horse culture. And in between, in the circle there, you see the two rivers, the Euphrates on the left and then the Tigris, and they were the thing that determined the life of the land, as the Nile was in Egypt, because the land was otherwise pretty barren. But that made it possible to irrigate the land, which they were able to do very cleverly. They were good engineers from the word go. But now, if we jump ahead to about 300 AD, we find that the area had been known by the Greeks, used by the Greeks, but not ever fully settled by them. The Romans came along, it was pretty much the same thing. But when the Persian Empire began, they were very aggressive, and of course they were right next door, and they rolled right over into it, conquered that area, and it was within the Persian Empire then for several hundred years. And within those bounds, it again was very successful in the sense of being able to feed itself and others. There were no natural resources. It was only much later that oil was found there and started to be used for other things. But the Persian Empire was brought to a halt. They, of course, interacted with the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, when that got going. And by the year 600, the Persians were still pretty dominant, 600 AD this is, and Iraq was there. Originally called, I guess, just by tribal names, but it began to be called Iraq in medieval literature, and a lot of literature survived, because one of the great things in their past culture was that they discovered or invented writing.
Oh.
And of course, everybody had a language by then. You had many different ones. And that was another hallmark of their civilization. Many things came together there. It was a composite. It was not just one solid thing, pretty much like Egypt. There was all kinds of different things, with many different languages. They developed many different religions. The problem was that they, and many different tribes, they didn't always get along too well with each other. And you find that very same thing today.
Oh, yes.
That has really not changed. It boiled down really then into the north, the center, and the south. The north centered around Mosul, it still does, and the central region around Baghdad, and then the south around Basra, and where the two rivers came together, and the Shatt al-Arab, and then down to the Persian Gulf. So it was always a channel for trade for that reason, because Syria was a major. We looked at Syria a few years ago, and found that it was a hinge between Europe and Asia, and the traffic and the movement of peoples, and it participated in that. But the Persians eventually were defeated, and what came up next? Think of the year 600, and what happened then in that following century. Muhammad happened.
Okay.
And the Arabs were directly south. Could we see that first picture, please? The second picture now, the first map. This map shows you Iraq is a bright green in the middle there. And you see the very large state of Iran to its east. Beneath it, Saudi Arabia, desert territory. To the west of it, Syria, and Lebanon was later carved out of Syria, but then Turkey on the north. So it's surrounded by three rather vigorous groups of people. They too consisted of more tribes at first, but then settled into these monolithic countries. So after the Persian Empire was back within its own borders, then you see to the south, the Arabian Peninsula, they began burgeoning outward. When Muhammad died in 632, I believe, leaving behind this very effervescing almost religion that was just spreading like mad. And they spread north, and they discovered what we will call Iraq from now on. They discovered that, and they settled it. Here was this country. It was dry, but the soil good, and plenty of water to irrigate it with. So there was just massive immigration, and that's when the whole Arab culture began to move in there on top of the others. The Arab established a caliphate, and we ran into the term caliphate, of course, with ISIS, with Daesh.
Yes.
And a caliphate, I want to read this because I wrote this down carefully to cover the different things of what a caliphate is. A political religious state comprising all Muslim communities and their lands and dominions. Now, that means I think, to me, it's comparable to the Roman Catholic dominion, so to speak, in the world, because you have a pope in charge of all of the Catholics, wherever they are.
All the Roman Catholics.
And wherever they were, particularly wherever they dominated, there were more Catholics. There was a strong influence. Well, the same thing happened around in the Near East area with the Arabs, having taken up the Muslim religion. And they added another thing. They didn't convert everybody, but their expansion was not peaceful and gradual. It was explosive, it was violent, and this was sort of within their religion. And of course, we think of the Spanish Inquisition, we realize that can happen other ways too. But here was Iraq anyway, used to being dominated by the Persians for several hundred years, just as they came out of the earlier stages. Then they were dominated by the Arabs, by this Arab Caliphate. Now the Arabs, as they did in Spain and other areas, did not squelch the Persian top layer. They just put them aside and took big taxes from them, and that was their method of operating. And we see later on in the caliphate that came up recently here, that was supposed to cover everybody, but it was mainly political and military. And there wasn't all that much of doctrine. They seized upon anything they could that might support an idea of violence. So they went through that. Now the next scene in our little play here is going to be what happened to them, because the caliphate didn't last forever. It did last until the Mongol invasions, and they were in the 1200s. Let's look at another map, please, our third picture. This shows you this relief map, and you see how most of Iraq was the green there, the lower land, the desert, but a little of it was higher land, and going east was mountains, and to the south, desert, and to the west, desert. As you went into the Syrian area, and to the north, then less desert, but still a livable climate up there in the north. The next picture will show us these three basic things I mentioned, three basic parts of the area itself, regardless of who's there. You have a northern part, and this coalesced around Mosul in Arab days. And then the central, Baghdad, this was the main Arabic settling. And then in the south, you had an area that was marshland most of the time, and led down then to the Persian Gulf. The marshland and the irrigation became a problem at one point, because the violence resulted in doing away with the irrigation. So that meant doing away with a lot of the food, and conditions got very much worse for that. But under the Mongol dominion, the Mongols left them alone pretty much, exploited them somewhat, but didn't, still it was a hand on top of them. They had their own local governments, or local, what you might call governments, the tribal right. things coming on from there. As time progressed, then, in the middle of the 1500s, what did away with the Mongols really, the last vestiges of that was the, I'm sorry, excuse me, was a whole new thing, and this was the Ottoman Empire.
Oh, okay.
The Turkic peoples from the western part of the Mongol Empire just got together, rose up, and again, a sort of a bird effervescing, like the way the Mongols had, beginning of the 1200s, and just all over everything, and lasting into the next century. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem with the Ottomans was the Ottomans didn't exert an awful lot of personal control over them, but so they could have their own local tribes and things to some extent, but they still had no freedom to do what they wanted to do, and they still had this composite nature. In fact, even more composite under each of these things, because there'd be a new overlayer over them all. Mm-hmm. So the Ottoman Empire actually lasted until World War I, and finally done away with it, just withered away and died. And we saw last time, in fact, that it still controlled North Africa in the early days of our country.
Right.
And it still let the rulers there condone piracy and not be very kind, be nasty to their prisoners. But in the World War I, they were done away with completely. Now, the beginning of the 1900s was when oil was discovered by the British. And the British, meanwhile, during the 1800s had looked for a quicker way to get to the Far East. In the meantime, the British East India Company had gotten out there. Business was going on. The Royal Navy was doing great things, but you had to go around Africa to get to the Far East. And even after the Suez Canal, it still wasn't as easy as it might have been. Now, another picture, please. Next picture. This is Iraq pretty much as it is today, in between the other surrounding nations. The next picture shows us something from the Persian days, and this was an arch. The ruins of that arch we actually saw in Iraq in the 1950s, or in Iraq. And I think they've reconstructed all this brick structure around it. But I don't remember driving through it. I don't think the arch was complete at the time. But it was a Persian arch. I kind of see me and die. It was the Ozymandias, the poem, the Lord of Lords. The next picture is one more picture of what it was like in the very old days. And you see how far they had come from them, and the clothing that they developed. But the fringy garments. But this art of making something, printing something in clay, as it were, is another illustration of how they got started with writing. They did have a lot of clay, and with water, clay could be used to write on. And this is the famous cuneiform writings, many of which it was used by all of them at one time in a couple of millennia BC. Because there's correspondence exists in Egypt, in Turkey, in ruins in Turkey, of the cuneiform tablets, accountings of wars and things like that. But now, the next picture carries us suddenly, this is really two pictures, to the 1830s, when the British had gotten this idea, or a couple of wild thinkers had, possibly you could just go overland, just sail, go by water to the eastern Mediterranean, just cross overland to the Persian Gulf, and you'd be right there. And as you saw from the relief map, it isn't so easy. There are a lot of mountains in there. But this was an attempt. Now, the two that are steaming from their pipes there, as it were, are two ships. They're paddle steamers. And the British Navy and the East India Company got together, and they sailed over, and they took their ships apart, and they carried them over the mountains and over this territory to the Euphrates River in Iraq. And this was one of the first real exposures the Iraqis had. They were still in tribes, local tribes, and there were Shia and there were Sunni, and there were all kinds there were a few Christians, many different things. But now go back to the pictures, please, because I want you to see, these were on the Euphrates River in 1836, and they were little gunships. They were prepared to defend themselves against local tribes. And of course, the local tribes were always at each other's throats too. And the lower picture, you see a shot of this came out of a book I have, and I'm sorry I couldn't really make it any bigger handily. But you see on the left and on the right, you can notice big circles. Well, those are irrigation machinery, and you can see that they were at a rather primitive level still, very effective and very good engineering. But now down to the next picture, please, and we're going to take a look. Well, let's hold that for a minute, because I want to come forward from World War I to the later days there. They ceased to exist as a province of the Ottoman Empire, because of course there was no more Ottoman Empire, and there was chaos and confusion for a couple of years in there after the World War ended. And in 1920, the League of Nations, the nations that were going to form that, established a mandate over Iraq and another one over Syria. They were going to put them back in order. And the French got Syria and the British got Iraq. And what they did was very, very soon after that, in 1922, I think, they established a monarchy. They got hold of one of the tribes, the Hashemite tribe, I guess, and they established a monarchy, and the monarchy was completely under British control, of course. Iraq continued to get back into some kind of order, but the mandate ended in 1932, and at that point, this coat of arms came into effect. Iraq became an independent country, a Republic of Iraq. But that didn't last for too long, because the monarchy was overthrown in 1958. And we had been there in the mid-1950s, and it didn't seem like a military state or anything. It just seemed like a pleasant place to pass through on your way from somewhere, do a little tourism. And I wanted to we stayed in Baghdad, and I wanted to go see the ruins of Babylon, and we did. And you drove past that old Persian arch on the desert. You drove down for a couple of hours, and there were these ruins of Baghdad. Not very much to see. I think archaeology has since done wonders. But here was another piece of glorious past, and yet here was this country, poor but rich, rich but poor, at each other's throats all the time, too many different things put together, and none of them really wanting to be with the others. Meanwhile, of course, oil had been discovered. The foreign interests were dominating the oil completely, and that was sparking a rivalry amongst Britain, France, the United States was into the act by then, all wanting to get hold of the oil things. And of course, here were Iraqis, some instant millionaire folks who could have done a lot, who really, of course, didn't. It was just pretty chaotic and unstable. In the, by 1980, they had established a military, a political regime. The monarchy was long gone. The regime was, there was another insurgents against them, but they came back. And in 1979, the Ba'athist Party and Saddam Hussein took over. In 1980, you may recall, this is all, of course, within our times, the war with Iran. There was a nasty little war with Iran for a few years there. That came to an end. The instability and the chaos continued. In 1990 and 91, you had Kuwait. This was the United States, primarily, with a coalition. And unfortunately, Iraq just moved down and occupied it. They were taking this. The United States crossed the red line, whatever was there, and drove them back with this coalition, but did not follow up in any way, just left it there.
Right.
And we know pretty well now what the result was.
So we're almost down to the last minute now.
Last minute.
Let's tie it up as to
Well, we'll
what
tie it up
happens
quickly
now.
then. I'm going to make a sort of a summary. I don't think anything has advanced at all. I always end on a hopeful note. But let us have that picture, please, of Saddam Hussein. We see him with his happy smile and his military bearing and his henchmen around him there. Next picture. This is the Emperor, the Persian Emperor Sennacherib. And just before the Mongol, just before the Arabic takeover, he was an absolute monarch of a huge area there. And you see that he was, looked very different. They still wore whiskers, but this was where they did the art in the old days. So he was there. There is Sennacherib. In between, you had various other dictators. The next picture shows us some modern time Iraqi soldiers in front of a large airplane. And next picture will show us Iraqi soldiers of the old days with their horses, and some of their how they harnessed and used the horses.
So about what we can figure is that Iraq is still fighting that tribal image.
Iraq is still coping with it. And the British, what the British did when they took over the mandate, when the League of Nations did, they drew the present boundaries, which included some of Kurdistan, as did Syria and Turkey, and a little bit of Iran, and a constant source of trouble.
Right.
And within the country of Iraq, other areas and you had Sunni versus Shia. You had all kinds of other.
Maybe that helps us understand a little bit more about
I think it
how
does.
torn up the country is and how difficult a situation it is.
And it wasn't open to the outer world because it was surrounded by these countries. Right. I mean, it was open in a sense, especially modern with airplanes and so on, but couldn't just walk over a border and be out somewhere free.